Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. I appreciate it greatly. And thank you all for coming out. I know that it's the end of summer. You've probably got a lot to go, a lot of opportunities to do things on a Saturday evening, but you're here, and I appreciate that very much. Before I go any further, one person that I need to acknowledge from the very outset is John Powers, who served as Justice of the Court of Appeals for the 3rd District of Texas. Justice Powers is, among his many other accomplishments, author of the first Texas Navy, that may be the single most deeply researched and authoritative book on the Texas Navy published to date. If you have an interest in the Texas Navy, if you have an ongoing interest in the Texas Navy, I can't recommend this highly enough. This really should be on your bookshelf. And no, these markers in here are not props. Those are all authentic bookmarks that I use. Judge Powers passed away almost exactly a year ago, but right to the end, he was continuing his research and writing on the Texas Navy. A good bit of the insight and information that I will be sharing with you this evening is based on his work that, sadly, he did not live to see published. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Deborah Powers for extending me the great privilege of sharing some of her late husband's research in this public setting. Mrs. Powers, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Now, the story of the campaign of the Texas Revolution and the Battle of San Jacinto is well known here. Is well known to everyone here this evening. In the role that the Texas Navy played in events here on April 21st, 1836, that role has often been told as well. There are some inaccuracies in the story, as it is usually told. Some aspects of those events have been largely glossed over or ignored. It's my hope this evening to fill in some of those gaps and perhaps correct a few misunderstandings. To recap very briefly, the incidents we're discussing this evening occurred simultaneously with the principal campaign of the Texas Revolution, primarily between February and April 1836. And you should have been given on your way in a document that looks like this, which is a running chronology of events that happened within the Texas Navy in one column, and perhaps more familiar events from the Texas Revolution in the other. It's important not just to understand that these things were happening, that these events were interleaved with each other, but it's also useful to keep in mind that for a large degree, these two things were happening independent of each other, and the people who were involved in the events in one column were unaware of what was happening in the other column. So it's important to keep in mind as we talk about these events at sea that they were happening at the same time as events on land we were so familiar with, including the fall of the Alamo, Coleto Creek, and the Goliad Massacre, and of course the Battle of San Jacinto. I'm going to start with a vessel called the Liberty. The Liberty was the first and smallest of the original 4 vessels of the Texas Navy. She had originally been the civilian schooner William Robbins. A group of citizens from Matagorda, one of the many committees of safety organized during the run-up to the Texas Revolution, offered financial backing to purchase the vessel, but ultimately Thomas F. McKinney bought the schooner outright for the use of the provisional government of Texas. Now, Liberty was small, with a full complement of perhaps 35 officers, seamen, and Marines, with an armament of just 6 small cannon. Liberty sailed from Galveston on February 22nd, 1836, and set a course to seek prizes on the Yucatecan coast. Liberty's destination was the settlement of Sisal, a small town on the northern coast of Yucatan that at the time served as the port for the provincial capital of Merida. At the time, Sisal had a population of perhaps 1,000 people, most of whom were employed in fishing or in small coastal trading. There was a small Spanish-era fortress there that still stands. That's in the top photo. Sisal did not have a sheltered harbor, but vessels calling there simply had to anchor off the beach and have their cargoes carried back and forth by small vessels called lighters. Sisal, at the time we're talking about in 1836, had a population of maybe 1,000 people. It only has about 2,000 people today. So I think if you were able to visit Sisal today, and these are modern photographs of what Sisal is like, probably it's very, very similar to the way it was 180 odd years ago. Now, the second vessel in this story is the schooner Pelicano, or Pelican. Pelicano had been engaged in trading between New Orleans and Campeche. On February 14th, 1836, Valentine's Day, Pelicano arrived at New Orleans from Campeche in ballast, meaning that she had no cargo. Soon afterward, her master, a man named Davis, was replaced by a new officer named Manuel Perez Espinola, who was just 21 years old. The reason for the change in the schooner's master is not known, but it was not uncommon. Pelicano loaded a cargo of 550 barrels and 2 bags of flour, so the manifest said, and sailed again for Campeche and the port of Sisal in late February, around February 27th. The cargo had been shipped by the local New Orleans firm of J.W. Zachary and Company, who are general merchants in New Orleans. Zachary and Company were well established in New Orleans by the mid-1830s, shipping all around the Gulf of Mexico, both coastwise to U.S. ports and to ports in Mexico and Cuba. Their trade to Mexico was especially lucrative. Zachary and Company traded in all sorts of commodities and merchandise, but in this case, the cargo of flour was significant because, along with corn, it was one of 2 commodities that the Mexican authorities allowed foreign flag ships to land in the Yucatan as a result of persistent famine there. There was an ongoing revolution. There were ongoing uprising and insurgency in the Yucatan. And the centralist Mexican government was trying to crack down on war supplies and material and contraband coming into the area. The barrels were later found, of course, to contain smaller kegs of gunpowder. After they were found out, naturally, Zachary and Company denied any knowledge or responsibility for the gunpowder aboard the ship. So Pelicano arrived off the port of Sisal on March 5th, 1836. It appears that rumors of the schooner's illegal activities were already known there, because immediately upon Pelicano's arrival, the port captain, Juan Fernandez Cota, had Captain Perez and some of his crew detained and taken on shore in suspicion of smuggling. Captain Fernandez put a guard aboard Pelicano and took additional steps to disable the ship to prevent it being sailed away in the night. What did Captain Fernandez know or suspect about Pelicano's contraband cargo? We don't know. But we do know this much. Contrary to what's often been written about the gunpowder hidden aboard Pelicano, it almost certainly was not intended for the government and for the Mexican government, and very likely was destined for the rebels in Yucatan, who were fighting their own struggle against the centralist government in Mexico City. It's also possible that Captain Fernandez had no specific intelligence about the gunpowder, but was instead simply trying to shake down the young master of Pelicano for a bribe or other consideration. That certainly was the general mode of operating by Mexican officials in Yucatan at the time, who enriched themselves handsomely by trading in black market goods and seeking other considerations. The worst among these in 1836 was this charming fellow, Francisco de Paula y Toro, who was explicitly tasked with interdicting smuggling. During his tenure as governor, Toro accumulated a very large fortune. The law gave him an incentive to arrest and prosecute smuggling, as he personally received half of the proceeds from a public sale of seized contraband. He undoubtedly made a great deal more money under the table by taking payoffs from smugglers in return for letting them go unmolested. Just to give you an idea of the sort of money that he personally accumulated in his role as governor, if you Google his name today, the first hits you find will be a magnificent, beautiful, it's very small, but it's a beautiful theater that still exists in the Yucatan that he had built out of his personal wealth that he accumulated. And so that's a very nice legacy for a very, very crooked man. Whatever plans Captain Fernandez or Governor Toro might have had for Pelicano's cargo, though, they were for naught. Late on the afternoon of March 5th, same day as Pelicano arrived, Liberty arrived at Sisal and anchored several miles south of town, where they could observe the ships at anchor. All the vessels they observed were foreign ships, and so were immune to seizure by the Texans, save for one large schooner that flew a Mexican ensign, Pelicano. Liberty's crew initially believed that this vessel was a Mexican warship and decided to attempt to board and capture her during the night. In fact, the large schooner was Pelicano, already under arrest by the port captain and with an armed guard aboard. A heavy sea set up after dark, and Liberty's two larger boats were damaged trying to launch them. At 11 p.m., they set out in Liberty's smallest boat with 14 armed men crammed into this tiny little boat. They quickly procured, stole, borrowed, depends on who you believe. They quickly procured a boat from the American schooner Sabine, and after dividing the boarding party between the two boats, set out again for Pelicano. The Texans, by the way, the Texian account, firsthand account of this says, "Oh, we explained what we were doing, and they were happy for us to take the boat." The master of Sabine, who never got his boat back, by the way, naturally he insisted, "Oh, they came on board and they stole the boat at gunpoint. What can we do?" And there are good reasons, regardless of how it happened. There are good reasons that each of those parties told that story the way they did. The Texians boarded Pelicano almost simultaneously from both sides, and the fight was over very quickly. Pelicano's guards and remaining crew were quickly overwhelmed. Some accounts say that all of the Mexicans on board were killed, while others claim that some were wounded or captured. There were no Texian casualties. Liberty's prize crew managed to get the schooner underway, and the pair of them sailed back to Texas together. They arrived off Paso Caballo at the entrance to Matagorda Bay on March 15th. That's 9 days after the capture. Liberty got safely across the sandbar at the entrance to the bay, but Pelicano grounded hard and was battered by the surf. Efforts began to recover Pelicano's cargo, still understood to be simply barrels of flour, that would be a valuable addition to the Texian cause. Now, this illustration, probably many of you have seen before. It was drawn around 1960 by a very well-known Texas artist by the name of Buck Shewitz, and it shows the crew of the Liberty inspecting the cargo of flour and finding the gunpowder stashed inside. I'm surprised that the little keg of gunpowder doesn't have XXX on it like it does when in the cartoons. But this shows them finding the powder when they inspected the ship. That's not how it happened at all. They sailed all the way back to Texas, believing that they had captured a nice prize schooner with a cargo of flour, which was itself extremely valuable. Now, during the salvage, during the process of moving the heavy barrels, one was stove or broken open, and a smaller keg was found inside. The keg contained gunpowder. More barrels were opened, and each one contained another keg of gunpowder. In all, about 300 kegs of gunpowder were found, which became an enormously valuable contraband cargo for the Texian cause. Now, this is where a lot of researchers, including myself, get off track. At the end of March, camped with the Army on the west side of the Brazos River, Sam Houston wrote out a famous proclamation to Texans and their supporters in the United States. He gave a brief outline of the military situation, expressed confidence in his ultimate victory, and sent out a call for support for volunteers and other support for the Texian cause. His appeal was published around the country, as here in Niles' Weekly Register about 5 weeks later. He included a line about the capture of the flour and gunpowder that refers to Liberty's capture of Policano. It's very easy to assume, as many of us have, and again, I was misled by this initially, that Houston was referring to contraband cargo already received by his army in the field, even though he was writing only 3.5 weeks after the schooner's capture. But Judge Powers' research definitively shows that this is not correct, and that the gunpowder aboard Policano could not have reached Sam Houston before the battle. I have to say, I was very disappointed to learn, to be disabused of that notion. Now, Powers reconstructed the timeline, and that timeline is included on your handout. He showed that Liberty's crew salvaged Policano's cargo on March 19th and sailed for the Matagorda anchorage on March 22nd. The cargo was left behind on the beach at Pascavallo. Captain William Brown of Liberty, recognizing the value of the salvaged cargo, impressed the civilian schooner Durango to accompany Liberty back to the pass to recover it, which they did beginning March 30th. So now we're more than 3 weeks out from the original capture. And we're also right at the time when Sam Houston was writing his proclamation in camp. But even more pressing duties interfered, requiring the evacuation of Matagorda and the destruction of property that could not be moved. The two ships finally sailed for Pascavallo from Matagorda, again on April 18th, and did not arrive in Galveston until April 25th after the battle. But as Judge Powers points out, this doesn't diminish the value of Policano's cargo to the Texian cause. The Republic's independence was in no way assured in the immediate aftermath of San Jacinto, and the contraband cargo captured at Sisal, both in the form of munitions and in foodstuffs, remained in desperately short supply for months after the victory. And now we'll talk about the schooner Invincible, which I know many of you have probably heard of. Invincible is undoubtedly the most famous of the first 4 ships of the Texas Navy because she has had the most eventful career, was wrecked in combat, and has been the subject of archaeological efforts to locate her for the last 3 decades. That's an ongoing saga for a different evening. She was launched at Baltimore in 1835 and was a very popular type known in that day as the Baltimore Clipper. Invincible was allegedly built as a slaving ship, although there is no evidence that she ever actually carried enslaved persons. The same general type of vessel, the Baltimore Clipper, was used for many applications, including general cargo vessels, naval and revenue cutters, and for privateering. Invincible was purchased at the beginning of January 1836 by Texian agents Samuel May Williams and Thomas F. McKinney, and under the command of Jeremiah Brown, William Brown's brother, very quickly became the most active vessel in the Texian squadron. On April 3rd, 1836, Invincible was patrolling off the mouth of the Rio Grande when she engaged a Mexican vessel called the Bravo. Late in the action, a larger vessel, a 2-masted brig, appeared heading for the entrance to the river. Invincible broke off the engagement with Bravo to inspect the new arrival. The brig proved to be the American merchant vessel Pocket, carrying foodstuffs for the Mexican Army, along with a Mexican naval officer, Lieutenant Don Carlos Ocampo, 3 American naval officers who had recently been granted commissions in the Mexican Navy, and a detailed chart of the Texas coast. It's important to keep in mind that in those days, unlike today, where you can pull up GPS on your phone, we have easy access to accurate nautical charts. Accurate nautical charts in those days, updated accurate charts, were very highly prized and often would be considered what we would now call classified material. So the capture of these detailed, up-to-date charts of the Texas coast was not just convenient, it was actually very important to indicate what might be going on with the Mexican Navy, that they were interested perhaps even in landing. Recognizing the value of Pocket and her contents, Captain Brown decided to ignore the fact that the brig was an American vessel and therefore nominally neutral, and immediately sailed for Galveston. Invincible and Pocket arrived at Galveston on April 7th, 1836, 2 weeks before the Battle of San Jacinto. Pocket's cargo consisted primarily of foodstuffs, including 100 barrels of flour, lard, and rice, and 600 to 700 barrels of prepared biscuit. The biscuit would have been especially valuable to Houston's army, as it could be distributed directly to the troops without the need for baking or other preparation. Now, by this time, Galveston had become the rallying point for people and supplies evacuated ahead of the advancing Mexican army. But foodstuffs were in very short supply. Captain Brown turned over Pocket and her cargo to Colonel James Morgan, the military commandant at Galveston. As recently as April 4th, just a few days before they arrived, there had been no flour, no sugar, and no coffee in Galveston. But the day after Pocket's arrival, Moore reported to the acting Secretary of War, Thomas Jefferson Rusk, that he had sent sugar, coffee, and 40 barrels of flour up from Galveston toward Houston's army aboard the sloop Ohio. Also part of Ohio's cargo destined for Houston Army were a pair of small field artillery pieces donated by the citizens of Cincinnati that would later be known as the Twin Sisters. Ohio and an unidentified steamboat, perhaps Laura or Cayuga, delivered to Harrisburg the sugar, coffee, and, quote, flour in abundance, unquote, that was soon put on the road to Houston's army, where they arrived around April 10th or April 11th, just before the army began crossing over the Brazos on the march eastward, eventually to San Jacinto. Judge Powers argues that while isolated lots of foodstuff were being brought to Galveston after being evacuated from points west, the circumstantial evidence argues strongly that the foodstuffs arriving in Galveston aboard Pocket on April 7th, already packed and organized, were the same that Colonel Morgan shipped out aboard the sloop Ohio the next day. Early chroniclers of the San Jacinto campaign, going back as far as 1860, attributed Houston's timely resupply at the Brazos to the cargo of Pocket, quote, a most timely assistance to the victors of the field of San Jacinto, who, short of provisions for themselves, were thereby enabled to retain the prisoners taken at that decisive victory, close quote. As Judge Powers notes in his attribution, made within living memory of the events in question, this attribution of this supply of Houston's army coming from the brig, capture of the brig Pocket, has never really been seriously challenged. What is true without a doubt is that General Houston and the Army recognized the contributions of the Texas Navy in their victory on the field at San Jacinto. After capturing Santa Anna's war chest containing over $18,000, the Army voted to distribute $3,000 of that amount to the Texas Navy before dividing the rest among the officers and enlisted men of the Army. That allocation was not theoretical. It was not academic. It was not an academic question to those men, because for each one of them, it represented a substantial decrease in the amount they themselves would receive after the money was divided up, after the remaining money was divided up. It stands as a testament to the role of the Texian Navy in the San Jacinto campaign that the soldiers themselves recognized the Navy's contribution to the eventual victory. Now, tonight we've talked about the role that the capturing of two specific Texas Navy vessels made or didn't make in the events on this spot on April 21st, 1836. But as author Jonathan Jordan points out in an appendix to his one-volume history, The Lone Star Navy, the impact of the Texian Navy went far beyond those two events. The victory here at San Jacinto, while dramatic, did not make for the defeat of the entire Mexican army in April 1836. There were large detachments of the Mexican army still in the field that, had they been able to combine forces, likely would have overwhelmed Houston's army even after San Jacinto. But they didn't, in large part because they themselves had been denied supplies, intelligence, and reinforcements by the activities of the Texian Navy along the coast. Not only did the captures made by Liberty and Invincible provide desperately needed supplies to the Texian Army, they and other captures were denying those same supplies and much more to the Mexican Army. Whatever their contribution to the victory here was, the efforts of the Texian Navy in March, April, and beyond ensured that San Jacinto would be the final battle of the campaign and a decisive strategic victory as well as a tactical one. The Texian Navy's efforts set the stage that made the Battle of San Jacinto the final and ultimate victory of the Texas Revolution. Thank you.